Most people think that the beer brewing ends when the bottle is filled, the can is sealed, or the glass is served. But inside a brewery, the story does not end there. Long before beer reaches the customer, the brewing process leaves behind something heavy, wet, and easy to overlook: large amounts of used grain. This leftover grain is called brewer's spent grain. The name itself makes it sound finished, as if its useful life is already over. But that name hides the real story, because the grain is not useless. It has already given up its sugars for brewing, but it still contains fiber, protein, texture, and food value. That is what makes this story so interesting. The product people are paying attention to is beer, but sitting beside it is another possible product that most people never think about. It is not glamorous. It does not come in a shiny bottle. It does not have a famous label. But in the right hands, this so-called waste can become the beginning of a completely different business. To understand the opportunity, we have to begin with the grain behind most beer. Beer is commonly built on malted barley. Barley that has been soaked, allowed to begin germinating, and then dried so its starches can later be converted into fermentable sugars. Some beers also use grains like wheat, corn, rice, oats, or rye. But malted barley is the classic foundation of brewing. During brewing, hot water is mixed with the crushed malted grain in a step called mashing. This pulls sugars and other soluble components out of the grain. Those sugars later feed the yeast, and the yeast helps turn them into alcohol and carbon dioxide during fermentation. But once those sugars are extracted, the grain itself is left behind. It is wet, bulky, and produced in large quantities. That leftover material is what brewers call spent grain. Not because it has no value, but because it has already served its original purpose in making beer. Traditionally, brewers' spent grain has often been used as animal feed, compost, or a low-value byproduct. That is still useful, and it is certainly better than simply throwing it away. But from a business perspective, the deeper question is different. Is the grain only a leftover? Or is it an ingredient waiting for a better use? That question changes everything. Once the sugar is removed, the grain still has parts that matter for food: fiber, protein, and texture. It may no longer be useful for making beer, but that does not mean it has no value. It only means its original role is finished. That is where the hidden value mindset appears again. Someone looked at brewer's spent grain and did not stop at the word spent. They asked what else it could become. Could it be dried? Could it be milled? Could it become flour? Could it become an ingredient for bread, pasta, snacks, protein bars, or other foods? The answer was yes, but the transformation was not automatic. Wet grain spoils quickly, so it cannot simply sit around waiting for someone to use it. It needs to be collected, stabilized, dried, milled, and processed in a way that makes it safe, useful, and consistent for food production. The main product created from brewer's spent grain is not beer. And it is not another drink. It is usually an upcycled grain powder or flour. The wet grain is collected from breweries, stabilized so it does not spoil, dried to remove moisture, and then milled into a useful ingredient. Once that happens, it can enter the food system again in a completely new form. That flour or grain powder can then be blended into familiar foods such as bread, crackers, snack bars, pasta, pizza crust, and baked goods. It can add fiber, plant protein, texture, and a sustainability story to products people already understand. So the genius is not just that spent grain is reused. The genius is that it is converted into an ingredient food makers can actually work with. One example is regrained supergrain plus, an upcycled ingredient made from brewer's spent grain. Instead of selling the waste story alone, the company turns the grain into a functional food ingredient that can support nutrition, flavor, and sustainability claims. That is when the byproduct becomes more than a leftover. It becomes a platform for many possible products. That process is where the business idea becomes real. A brewery byproduct can become an upcycled food ingredient only when someone solves the practical problems around it. The grain has to move from waste handling into ingredient design. It has to go from something a brewer wants to remove into something a food company wants to use. That is a powerful shift. The same material that once represented a cleanup challenge can become a practical ingredient inside everyday foods. Most consumers may never buy a bag labeled spent grain, but they may experience it as added fiber, added protein, richer texture, or an upcycled ingredient listed on a product label. And this is why the timing matters. Modern consumers are more aware of food waste, sustainability, nutrition, and where products come from. Food companies are also looking for better ingredients, better stories, and better ways to reduce waste in the supply chain. Brewer's spent grain fits that movement because it connects all of those ideas at once. It also creates a more interesting kind of business lesson. This is not just recycling. Recycling often means taking waste and making it less harmful. Upcycling tries to do something more ambitious. It takes something considered low value and turns it into something of higher value. That is exactly what happens when spent grain becomes a food ingredient. The genius is not that someone invented grain. The genius is not that someone invented beer. The genius is that someone noticed the gap between what a material was called and what it could still become. Because names are powerful. When we call something spent, we mentally close the door on it. When we call something waste, we stop looking closely. When we call something a byproduct, we often treat it as secondary before we have fully understood it. But business opportunities often begin right there. Not in the main product, but beside it. Not in the thing everyone is watching, but in the leftover stream that no one has learned how to value properly. That is why brewer's spent grain fits the Kaizen Smarter theme so well. It is not an accidental invention or a lucky mistake. It is a deliberate act of seeing differently. Someone looked at what breweries were already producing every day and asked a better question. What if this is not the end of the process? The answer created a new way to think about food waste. A brewery could produce beer and also contribute to new ingredients. A leftover grain could become a source of fiber, protein, and texture. A disposal problem could become a product story, and a material once pushed to the side could return to the food system in a new form. That is the deeper lesson here. Waste is sometimes not the absence of value. It is often the absence of imagination, timing, process, or market connection. The value may already be present, but it needs someone to recognize it and build the bridge between what it is and what it could become. The next great idea may not always come from creating something completely new. Sometimes it comes from looking at the side effect of an existing process and refusing to ignore it. Sometimes the real opportunity is not in the product everyone celebrates, but in the leftover everyone forgets. Beer made the grain famous for one purpose. Innovation gave it another. This is Kaizen Smarter, where curiosity meets clarity. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Kaizen Smarter.